Conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations.
Hi, I'm Mark Hoffman, retired history teacher and a proud member of the Conversation Across Time family. The theme of tonight's show is, when will they ever learn? President Obama has learned from the experiences in Vietnam and Iraq, and he has refused to put boots on the ground in Syria and Libya. President Obama has been roundly criticized by members of his own administration, namely Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, for not using more military action in the Middle East, but he refuses to do so because of the errors in Vietnam and Iraq. On the other hand, President George W. Bush never learned. Through deceit, conning, and bamboozlement, he convinced the Congress and the American people that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He got the Congress to give him absolute war power to invade Iraq, which ended in a costly and ridiculous war. Tonight's show will focus on Vietnam, how Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon lied to, bamboozled, and used cons to get the American people to believe that we were winning in Vietnam, when in fact we were losing. The fog of war tonight's panel includes Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who served under President Kennedy and Johnson, and who knew we were losing the war in Vietnam, but refused to speak out. Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher, who wrote The Prince. The Prince was the playbook for leaders throughout history to use political and governmental actions to further their own ends. And finally, yours truly, as Charles DeGaulle, the President of France, from 1958 to 1969, who continually warned American presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, about the perils of entering into a land war in Southeast Asia. Obviously, his warnings were not heeded, and the United States got involved in a terrible situation in Vietnam.
Good evening, and welcome once again to Conversations Across Time. Tonight's panel consists of, seated on my far right, President and General Charles DeGaulle. Welcome, President DeGaulle.
Glad to be here.
Seated next to President DeGaulle is a guest that's been here before also, and that is Mr. Niccolo Machiavelli. Welcome. Seated next to Mr. Machiavelli is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Welcome, Secretary McNamara.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
And, of course, seated next to my left, someone who's always here, our show co-host, Babette Josephs. Welcome, Babby.
My pleasure.
This is going to be fun tonight.
Yes, indeed.
We're going to battle tonight. So I'm going to come out the chute with a question for you, President DeGaulle. It's well known that you tried to warn the United States as far back as President Truman, I believe, that they should not be involved in Vietnam. Now, we know that we had some advisors there. We subsidized France. And so now on this panel tonight, we have seated with you Secretary McNamara. Is there any question or any comments that you would have for Secretary McNamara?
Yes.
Okay.
Should I refer to you as Mr. Secretary or
That'll
Robert?
be fine. Mr. Secretary will be fine.
Mr. Secretary,
Thank you.
I warned President Truman, I repeatedly warned President Kennedy and Johnson about our experience, the French experience in Vietnam, and why we failed, and how stupid it would be for the United States to get involved in a land war in Southeast Asia. Why was my advice not heeded? And you, of all people, who knew the war was going badly and refused to speak up, how do you countenance that?
Well, I think you have to take everything in context of when it happened. And of course, the communism was growing. It was a constant threat. We had
Come
lived.
on.
Excuse me?
I said, oh, come on, but keep going.
Oh, please. I mean, well, it really was. I mean, look what had happened. We had been through the war in Korea. There was the missile crisis, Russian communism. Communism was growing in Eastern Europe, was certainly growing in Southeast Asia. And it was the policy at the time, from Truman through Eisenhower to Kennedy, right through Johnson, to do whatever we could do to stop the incursion of the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong into the free Vietnam. Now, hold on. We tried originally to do it with advisors and CIA to train the locals to handle the situation. I know you say you warned us, but we had more capability to handle it militarily than you did at the time. And we felt it was most important to go ahead and to prevent this from creeping further. We considered it a domino in the total scheme of communism. And if this domino fell, then dominoes would continue to fall and eventually threaten the security of the people of the United States.
That's what they told us all.
Well,
That's what they told us.
So
Well, that's what it was.
Right.
I have to ask. One, there is reason to say that yes, United States had more military capability, but you already put it on the table that according to, most of the history we have, the United States did fall into one of the classic blunders. The first of which, of
Would
course,
you explain and classic blunder in terms of
the
political
classic
strategy?
the classic blunder is that you never get involved in a land war in Asia. There are some that are slightly less well known, but they're not relevant for this discussion.
Okay.
So, regardless of military might, how do you justify the population disparity, number one? Because, as you know, there were men of fighting age. There were so many in that generation that the more bodies the United States threw at Vietnam, the more loss the United States felt, but there was no opportunity for surrender for the Vietnamese because of their desire for autonomy. So how do you justify that? Understandable why you wanted to prevent communism philosophically.
Well, it's very easy. It's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback.
Yeah.
And looking back, and certainly
Yeah,
in
but
retrospect, there were a lot of things we could have done.
Mr. Secretary, that's disingenuous, because before you were involved and before there was a quagmire in Vietnam, I warned you, so that's not Monday morning quarterback. That's anticipatory. And
Wait a
your
second.
fundamental
The fact that you
your
warned me-
fundamental premise is
You
wrong.
could have warned me
It
from
wasn't
today
a
till
communist
tomorrow.
Movement. It was
But you warned Truman, and Truman didn't respect you one iota. He never respected
You
anything
guys
you
never
said, and
respected me.
neither
You
did
never
Eisenhower.
respected my country. That's part of your problem.
Well, it wasn't
Because
the country so
you're
much as you.
disrespectful
He
for
was a
me. You didn't
military
listen.
guy.
You were a communist sympathizer for a long time after during the second, at the end of the Second World War and during the occupation.
Nonsense.
Wait a second. We had to have you withdraw from. You
your
were looking to take
fundamental
more
premise
territory in
that
France.
you just stated, sir, was that we were stopping communists. And I told you early, not you, but I told your bosses, President Kennedy and President Johnson, that it was a nationalistic movement and that the Vietnamese communists would never ally with the Chinese communists. They were natural enemies. It goes back as long as the dispute between the Sunnis and the Shiites go back.
Yeah, we're talking
And
about-
the entire premise was wrong. And because you disrespected me and disrespected my country, you refused to listen. And what was it, 58,000 of your boys were killed?
Girls, too.
Girls, I'm sorry.
Again, this is all Monday morning quarterbacking.
Now-
No, it's not.
you were
Oh,
told.
please.
How can it be Monday
Listen.
morning? How can it be Monday morning?
I'm not
quarterback,
suggesting
Mr.
that mistakes
Secretary,
weren't made.
If I told you before you got in that it was wrong.
But I want to ask one question, because one of the things that has always baffled me is the similarities between what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Iraq.
In Iraq, which time?
I'm sorry.
This time.
George W.
Right now.
This time,
That's,
right
and I
now, this
understand.
moment.
I apologize to you, Senor Machiavelli. What I'm referring to is that this country got engaged in a war in the Middle East, in Iraq, with false information. And I want to specifically ask you about the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right.
Because
But you made it all up.
Well, wait,
I didn't make
I
it
don't
all
think
up.
I don't think he made
We
it up.
had,
Somebody made it
listen,
up.
You had intelligence.
It's a very good comparison, by
Yes.
the way, when you talk about what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Iraq.
Yes.
We, when I say we, the administration, had information from our intelligence agents that told us that this episode had happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Whether it was right or wrong, we didn't know that at the time, and we assumed that it was correct.
It's better
We
to
listened
have
to our
better
we listened to our
intelligence.
intelligence people, and as a result of that, the ball started to roll. And once the ball started to roll, well, it was pretty hard to bring it back. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately now in retrospect again, I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking
understand.
myself, but I know that mistakes were made. I knew in the middle of that conflict that we were never going to win, and I never told Johnson that because I knew he wouldn't accept that for 1 second.
Now, why wouldn't he
And
accept it? Why? I mean, he was your president. Why do you think he wouldn't accept it?
Because I was with him, I was close to him. He did not want to be the first president to be in office and lose a war, and that's what he would have been.
But he did.
You say he did. Well, listen, when they finally pulled out and they said, okay, we're leaving, we won. I mean, you can say that. The whole point is, and you brought this up, and it's really important, and I knew it was wrong, and I came out and told everybody that I knew it was wrong in retrospect, especially when I found out from the Vietnamese general in 1994 or 1984, when we met, he told me that Tonkin
Incident had never happened.
Had never happened. And I knew that. And I also knew, because I was there and I saw when we added additional troops, it didn't help at all. We put in 100,000 more men, and the war never moved forward. And I knew we were never, ever at that point going to succeed.
What was it? I'm sorry.
Well, I would like to know, for clarification, when you say the Iraq War started with bad information, you said Vietnam referred to the Gulf of Tonkin.
No, you're right. I
For the
need to
Iraq
explain
War,
it.
What information?
The bad
referred to?
information was that, and I don't even know if that the president at the time, George W. Bush, I don't know how much he knew, but I certainly believe that his vice president, Dick Cheney, knew.
Oh,
And
yes.
I mean, I mean that's pretty much.
Oh, yes.
So that they, with bad information, they went to the
His vice president. That's Dick.
Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney. So that they got the most trusted man in the United States at the time, and that was Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State. And they get Colin Powell to
More
go.
trusted than Dr. Ben Carson?
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
No question
And see,
about it.
the reason that
He's a
the
respected
Congress
military man.
exactly.
He was a respected statesman. He was well respected, more so than anybody else in the administration.
But Dr. Ben Carson performed heart surgery.
Well,
This
Dr.
isn't heart
fetuses.
surgery. This is
What's the
war. He
difference?
performed
I mean,
war. This
Yeah,
is different.
and Colin Powell
Comparison.
and Colin Powell.
So what?
Colin Powell, I guess because Ben Carson was somebody that was had a 15 minutes of fame. But Colin Powell was trusted because he was military.
Excuse me one
Yeah.
second, if I can say that, because I identify with Colin Powell.
Okay.
Because Colin Powell and I were in the same position. We worked for somebody. We worked for the administration. We could offer our opinion on things, but when it came time to effectuate policy and to stand up for the policy, we had to stand up for the policy of the administration. And Colin Powell did that in the face of, he knew, I didn't know at the time that Tonkin
So
was
wait a minute,
alive.
are you saying Colin
But
Powell
I think
knew?
Colin Powell probably knew.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, that sounds like the same
Yes,
defense
doesn't it?
that the Nazis
Doesn't it?
used in World War II. I'm shocked
yes,
that you would
indeed.
come
Wait a
and say,
second.
I
Where'd
work
you
for
come up with that
somebody.
one? Well, it wasn't my.
We're
It
just
wasn't my
following
call.
orders, just
I couldn't.
following
Wait a
orders.
second. I could. I
If
could
something
have.
is immoral, and it certainly was immoral to risk the lives of, and essentially they were poor Americans, not the
Yes,
rich, because
and
they
minority
were,
members.
I
they were all
understand.
deferred.
I understand
To
that,
risk
but
the
you
life,
missed my
it was
point.
immoral, and if you knew it was immoral, which you did,
We're not
then
talking
you
about-
were obligated to speak out. And to
Yes.
say I work for somebody is the defense that didn't fly in Nuremberg, which I visited.
And
during
so
the
let's-
trial.
I understand, but what we're talking about are two different things. I'm not talking
Really?
about during
I
the
don't
course
think
of the
so.
war. When I made those declarations in the beginning, and when I told Johnson about what had happened at Tonkin, I thought that that was the truth.
So
And
you
when
were
I spoke
misled
out
by
about
your
it then, I
intelligence.
thought it was the truth. Now, when you talk about later on, and I already admitted that I was wrong, and I came out, by the way, and in my book, when I wrote the book in the 1990s, I admitted that I was wrong to continue the war, and believe me, it's haunted me my whole life. And what I had hoped by writing that book was that if a situation like this ever came across again, that they would look at history, which was only 40 years before, and follow history and learn from history
Now-
and not get involved.
But
First,
it did happen again
But,
in
but,
Iraq.
but
and
that
we
comes
learned
back.
nothing.
So with Iraq,
Yes.
with
That's
Iraq
right.
specifically, I'm asking this question for a reason. What was the bad information?
The bad information,
WMDs.
that bad information was that Saddam Hussein had in his arsenal weapons of mass destruction. And so based upon that, the Congress issued the authority for us to go in and actually invade Iraq. And I know, Mr. Machiavelli, this might sound strange to you, but we had a vice president who pretty much told us, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when the American troops arrive in Iraq, Iraqi people are going to be lining, they'll be so happy.
Shocking.
Throw flowers at them
And welcome
invite
them in.
their homes. I don't know what he was smoking.
Mr. Secretary, though,
Well, we
Yeah,
can be sure
well-
it was the best.
let me just say
wait,
this.
wait.
Go ahead, I'm
your
sorry.
book was a mea culpa.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, in retrospect, if you were an advisor to President George W. Bush, you would have definitely advised him not to enter Iraq.
I would have definitely advised them not to enter Iraq, not only because of the weapons of mass destruction, which again, I would have been in the same position if the CIA actually said that there were
well,
weapons,
this time it
but
was the
because it
United
wasn't worth
Nations.
going to war at that time against Iraq. It was a reaction to 9/11. There was no indication whatsoever that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. From the very beginning, any kind of incursion into Iraq as justification or revenge for 9/11 was stupid.
Well, now let's unpack that, because let's not assume that the audience understands exactly what you're saying. I know that using that as a premise was wrong, but explain it to the audience just for benefit of those folks. First of all, the 9/11, most of those people who participated in the 9/11 attacks were not Iraqi.
None of
They
them
were they were Saudi.
12 of the 14 were from Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia is our what?
Well, Saudi
Ally.
Arabia was our ally, and it was an oil supplier.
Yeah.
And it was they were friends with the Bush family, by the way. I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
I think they called one of those sheiks there Uncle Sheik or whatever
Yes.
his name was. So, I mean, they were, well, am I right?
I'm guessing they would have
And
had
so there
trouble
was a very
pronouncing
close
his name.
relationship. But, I mean, nobody ever thought to invade Iraq. I mean, nobody said Saudi Arabia. I mean, they never said they had weapons of mass destruction. But to invade, first of all, to invade Iraq just because, even if they had weapons of mass destruction, the Iraqis and the Iranians created a balance of power in the Middle East. The Iranians were scared to death of the Iraqis because they didn't know what Saddam Hussein would do.
Right.
Yep.
And vice versa. And they had fought a war for 6.5 years. They threw poison gas at each other. They did whatever they had to do. But it was, I don't want to say it was peaceful, but there was a balance of power.
Exactly.
And it was contained.
Yes.
And I know, because I'm putting myself in the shoes of General Powell, I know that he told the administration, that he did, that if you do this, you're going to own it. And what he meant by that was, if you go in and disrupt this balance of power, all hell is going to break loose in the Middle East.
And
he
so
was
it
very
did.
prophetic, because
So
that's
it
exactly
did.
what happened.
But I want to ask this question, because, you know, when you were here before, President DeGaulle, essentially the same thing that you were saying then, you said. That you're saying now, you said then. And
Which
well, that
Which
the
is
United
that-
States shouldn't be. In fact, why don't we run the clip? I mean, I think that's probably the easiest way.
do we have footage?
We have footage. We have footage. I am from a generation where Vietnam is still an open wound. And so I would ask President DeGaulle, you had experience in Vietnam, and it's my understanding that you offered advice which was not accepted.
That is correct. We experienced a defeat in French Indochina in 1954, and I was not president at the time, but we sent our elite troops there, and we were defeated by the native population who wanted their independence. This was a time of nationalistic movements throughout the world. And my advice to the United States at that time, and my advice to the United States now, it's an unwinnable situation. You could have not defeated the indigenous force in Vietnam. You wasted your treasure and your resources and your manpower needlessly, and the United States needed to apply the same type of reasoning now and not make the same mistakes in the current situations throughout the world.
Now, President DeGaulle, as you watch, and that was on the anniversary when we were celebrating, or at least commemorating.
Marking.
Yes, marking. The fact that we had withdrawn and from a war that was no way we could win. What do you think now as you're sitting here? Because I don't think we've really addressed the fact that France was defeated at the Battle of Dien Phu. But what kind of troops were they?
We had our elite troops at Dien Phu.
Okay.
I told all the people in the administration that no matter how good your military is, no matter what weapons you bring to bear, you cannot win in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia because it is an indigenous, nationalistic war. I stress that over and over again. And the stupid, that's what the Americans were.
Okay.
They didn't understand la guerre and its stupidity on their parts.
Well, there's this. I realize, of course, that this is a sore spot, but there's an important point. There's an important
More
point.
than a sore spot.
Well,
The point,
And
let me
also-
just say this, excuse me,
It was
Machiavelli.
sort of his life, right?
It's so easy to say that now, and of course you're right.
it is easy.
You're right.
Well,
because
thank you,
what happened
Secretary.
was, the ends don't always justify the means.
Never.
But you're right. You were right. And it's easy to say that now. But in the context of the times, there's no question in our position that we had a better military. We had more people in the military. We were better equipped to handle the situation. It turned out that we weren't. And we were wrong. So you can accept,
But
my apology
here's
on
the
behalf of all
problem.
those presidents you warned.
When I
that we
said
were
this,
wrong.
that you cannot win indigenous nationalistic wars, no matter how good your military is, I knew from experience that our military couldn't win, and we were really good. Now you guys dismissed it, you don't like the French. However, history shows that indigenous nationalistic revolutions cannot be defeated militarily, and all you have to look at, Mr. McNamara, Secretary McNamara, is your own revolution.
Yes.
You're talking about the greatest military power at the
Great
time
Britain,
in the
yes.
world, and defeated by I shouldn't call it America's snot-nosed little country, but
That's
you
all
were
right.
at the time, and you defeated them because it was an indigenous
And it
guerrilla
was
war.
halfway across the world, which is the same.
Same.
It was the same,
Right.
but it was also
So-
a couple of hundred years.
If you do not learn,
That was a long time ago.
well, yeah, but if you do
different
not learn from the
systems,
mistakes
different
of
techniques.
history, you're doomed to repeat
Listen, I'm not
them.
making any excuses for what happened. I'm telling you that you're right. And in that situation, you were absolutely
But
right.
I guess my
the
question-
problem is, and the problem that I have, is that even though I admitted that we were wrong and mistakes were made, the most incredible thing, and I bring this up again because I think it's very important, is that 40 years later, less than 40 years later, the Americans, the people in the United States did the exact same thing.
And this is
That's the problem here.
Secretary McNamara, there are people in the military today that say if only we had used more force, we would have won in Vietnam. The reason we didn't,
I know that. That's the military
Vietnam.
position.
Well,
that's
but we
their
haven't-
job. That's
but
what
we
they're in
haven't-
business for. That's how they make their money. But that's not the point. That the president and the administration are the ones that have to make these decisions. They can listen to the military,
That's why we're
but the
supposed
decisions
to
have to
have
be made by the president, and they have
civilian-
to make the
a civilian
decisions
vote
based
for the
on
army.
history.
Senior
based on the
Machiavelli.
situation.
Here's an important point that hasn't really been addressed. We've talked in this discussion. We've talked about victory and we've talked about failure, but
How do you
especially
know?
if we examine, for example, what is now called the Korean conflict, and we compare that result with these other results that we've referred to. How do we define any of them as successes or failures definitively? You said Vietnam was a failure.
We don't know when we're victorious. So, like Bush says, we won, right?
But what is victory? I think that's the thing that we have to look at, because if you tell me that we've spent all these resources in Vietnam, as we have done in
Killed
Iraq,
so
and we
many people,
58,000
Yes.
Americans have died as a result, and how many hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in Vietnam?
2 million.
2 million.
Hey,
So
Raise
how?
army every day.
And so here's what I say. The title of this show, When Will We Ever Learn? I mean, that's where we are.
That's the point.
And that is, if there's nothing else that we leave here knowing, or at least having in our spirit, is it doesn't seem that we ever learn, because we keep repeating this mistake.
We are here doing this so that people will learn more about history, because the point is, if you forget history, you repeat it. Who said that? Not me. So let's not forget it.
But
Exactly. That's the point here.
But what are we to learn? That you asked the question, well, when will we ever learn? What lessons are we attempting?
Senior Machiavelli, I want to say something, and this is an apology to everyone that is watching this show and everyone that's in the studio audience, because I happen to be someone who came of age at a time when one of our lyricists, one of our poets, said something that made a lot of sense to me, and that is, all we are saying is give peace a chance. And that's my position.
And I think that's what Obama's position is now.
Yes.
And he's taking a lot of criticism because he's trying to use diplomacy rather than military might. And nobody before this time has done that.
Yes.
Yes.
He's taking a lot of heat for it, and I think in the long run,
He's right. of
years
course.
from now, we'll see that this is the way that
Yes.
you have to.
We'll look back at his legacy and
Especially for us, because we are the most powerful. I don't care what Trump says or anybody else says. We are a great nation, the most powerful nation, whose military is the most powerful military in the world. You can take all the great countries and combine them,
Yes.
and we still have the greatest military in the world.
Absolutely.
So we can always
But-
use might. But if you can use diplomacy and save the
Some
lives of
things-
millions and millions of people,
Some
then
things-
that's the way that we have to move
Some
forward.
things cannot be solved militarily. And
Secretary,
when people are defending their homes, their country, their families, it doesn't matter how big the army is, we cannot win. Whatever win is, we can't.
Well, we can't impose our will on the rest of the world, that's for sure.
but there were
We don't have to be
The
isolationists.
British couldn't do it to us.
there
can't enforce our might
there
on
were
them,
chances
etc.
to diplomatically end the war in Vietnam on numerous occasions. In fact, I tried to broker a few of those.
with
In
Ho Chi
fact,
Minh.
I was in contact with Ho Chi Minh. You guys didn't want to have the election because you were afraid that the election that the Geneva Agreement mandated to unite, make Vietnam one country, you were afraid that the people, Democratic, would elect Ho Chi Minh, so you withheld the elections, and I was negotiating with Ho Chi Minh to make some kind of deal where the war could end, and at the same time I was negotiating with Ho Chi Minh, your president, John F. Kennedy, authorized the CIA to get involved in a coup to overthrow President Diem in South Vietnam and nix the negotiations because his brother was willing to talk and work out some kind of peace settlement. So when you were Secretary of Defense, and I don't know if you were privy to this or it was only Dean Rustin, the Secretary of State, but you certainly, President Kennedy didn't want to use diplomacy, and your other boss, President Johnson, didn't want to use diplomacy.
This is a hot topic. And so what we are going to do is invite you back.